The scent of sizzling food filled the evening air as the city bustled with life. Cars honked in the distance, and people hurried past, their minds occupied with the worries of the day. In the midst of all this chaos stood Rafik, a humble street vendor, his small food cart glowing under the flickering streetlight. His hands moved with skill and familiarity, flipping warm golden parathas on a hot griddle while greeting customers with a warm smile. For years, he had stood at this very spot, serving hungry passers-by with delicious, affordable meals. That night, as Rafik wiped his hands on a cloth and prepared another plate, his eyes caught sight of a man standing a few feet away. He was dressed in tattered clothes, his face worn with exhaustion. The man hesitated for a moment, staring at the plates of food being served to customers. His eyes filled with longing. Rafik had seen this look before, the quiet hunger of someone who hadn't eaten a proper meal in a long time. The man shuffled closer, but stopped himself, as if debating whether to step forward or disappear into the shadows again. His hands were clenched tightly, and he swallowed hard before turning away. That was enough for Rafik to understand. Without hesitation, he scooped up a fresh serving of warm food, carefully packed it, and called out, "Bye, here, take this." The man turned, his eyes widening in surprise. I have no money," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Rafik shook his head. "No need for money, just eat." For a moment, the man didn't move. He seemed uncertain, as if kindness was something foreign to him. But as his stomach growled in protest, he hesitantly stepped forward and took the food with trembling hands. He looked at Rafik with an expression that was a mix of gratitude and disbelief. "Thank you," he murmured, before finding a quiet corner to sit and eat. Rafik watched him for a moment before turning back to his work. This wasn't the first time he had given food to someone in need, and it wouldn't be the last. He believed in kindness, in the simple act of helping someone without expecting anything in return. To him, a full stomach was worth more than a few lost coins. The night carried on. The usual customers came and went, and eventually, Rafik started packing up his cart. The city was winding down, and soon the streets would be empty. As he wiped down the counter one last time, he heard footsteps approaching. Expecting another late-night customer, he turned with his usual warm smile. But when he saw who stood before him, his breath caught in his throat. It was not an ordinary passerby. The man before him was well-dressed, his posture commanding, his eyes sharp and observant. He was someone who didn't belong in these parts, someone whose presence demanded attention. There was an air of mystery about him, a quiet power in the way he looked at Rafik. "I need to talk to you," the man said, his voice calm but firm. Rafik frowned, confused. "About what?" The man glanced around as if ensuring no one else was listening before he spoke again. "About what you did earlier tonight. About the food you gave." Rafik's confusion deepened. "I don't understand. It was just a meal." The man's lips curved into a small smile, but his eyes remained unreadable. It was more than just a meal. It was a choice, and choices have consequences. A strange unease settled in Rafik's chest. He had no idea who this man was or why he was here, but something about his words sent a shiver down his spine. "Who are you?" Rafik asked cautiously. The man tilted his head slightly, considering his answer. And then, after a pause, he said something that made Rafik's heart skip a beat. "I came because of the man you helped tonight." Rafik's mind raced. What could this mean? Had something happened to the hungry man? Why was this stranger here? Before Rafik could ask anything else, the man reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. He placed it on the food cart's counter and stepped back. Rafik looked down. and what he saw made his hands tremble. The night suddenly felt colder. Rafik's fingers twitched as he stared at the small object on his cart. It was a folded piece of paper, crisp, clean, out of place in the grimy, worn-out world he lived in. The streetlight above flickered, casting long shadows over the stranger's face. Rafik swallowed hard before slowly picking it up. His heart pounded as he unfolded it, his eyes scanning the words written in neat, deliberate handwriting. You never know who you are feeding. Rafik's breath hitched. His eyes lifted to meet the stranger's, but the man just stood there, calm, waiting. What does this mean? Rafik asked, his voice lower now, tinged with unease. The man exhaled, shifting his stance slightly. The one you gave food to tonight. He wasn't just any hungry man. Rafik frowned. He had helped countless people before, some homeless, some just struggling, some too ashamed to ask for help, but desperate enough to accept when offered. He never thought much beyond the act itself. To him, a hungry man was a hungry man. What else mattered? Who was he? Rafik asked, cautiously. The stranger took a slow step forward. A man who's been running. A man many people are looking for. He paused, watching Rafik's reaction. And now they might be looking for you too. A chill crawled up Rafik's spine. He shook his head. No, you're mistaken. I don't know anything about him. I just gave him food. Nothing else. The stranger's gaze didn't waver. That's exactly why I'm here. Rafik's mind reeled. He thought back to the man, the way he had hesitated, the way he had looked around, almost as if expecting something. Had he been afraid of being seen? Had Rafik missed the signs? And if he was indeed running, then from what? Or from whom? The city around them felt quieter now, as if even the night had paused to listen. The stranger leaned slightly closer. I need you to tell me everything he said. Every single word. Rafik tensed. He didn't know this man. He didn't know if he could trust him. Who are you? He asked again. The man studied him before answering. Someone who needs to find him before others do. Rafik's chest tightened. And if I don't tell you? The man's expression didn't change, but there was something in his eyes, a warning. Then you might be the next person they come looking for. A deep, sinking feeling settled in Rafik's stomach. He looked around the street, suddenly aware of how exposed he was. The shops were closed, the few remaining pedestrians passing by in their own little worlds. If someone was watching, he wouldn't even know. His mind raced back to the man he had helped. He had been quiet, desperate, but thankful. He had eaten quickly, almost too quickly, and then, just before he left, he had said something Rafik hadn't thought much about at the time. You are kinder than you know, and braver than you think. At the time, it had sounded like nothing more than a tired man's gratitude. But now, under the weight of the stranger's presence, those words felt heavier, more deliberate, like a message, like a warning. Rafik exhaled sharply. He had unknowingly stepped into something far bigger than himself. He had only done what felt right, giving food to someone in need. But now, that simple act had tangled him in something dangerous. And he had no idea how deep it went. The stranger's voice broke through his thoughts. Tell me what he said, Rafik. Rafik's heart skipped. He had never told this man his name. His blood turned cold. Rafik's breath caught in his throat. His name. He had never told this man his name. His grip tightened on the counter of his cart as his mind raced. Who was this stranger? And how did he know him? The man watched him carefully, as if measuring his next reaction. The street around them felt too open, too exposed. Rafik wanted to run, to disappear into the crowd, but his legs wouldn't move. I don't know anything. Rafiq finally said, his voice hoarse. The stranger tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. That's not true, Rafiq swallowed. He wasn't a man who got involved in trouble. He kept his head down, worked hard, and helped when he could. But now, he could feel the weight of something far beyond his understanding pressing down on him, the man he had helped. Who was he really? And why was this stranger so desperate to find him? Then, out of the corner of his eye, Rafiq noticed something. A car parked at the end of the street, its engine running. The windows were tinted, the figures inside barely visible. His heart pounded harder. They were watching. The stranger followed his gaze and exhaled sharply. "They're here," he muttered, under his breath. He turned back to Rafiq, his voice lower now, urgent. "Listen to me. I need you to leave, now." Rafiq hesitated. "Who are they?" "The kind of people you don't want to meet." Panic flared in Rafiq's chest. He had no idea what he had stepped into. But he knew one thing. He wanted no part of it. He quickly started untying his cart's canopy, his hands fumbling in haste. But before he could move, the stranger reached into his pocket and pressed something into Rafiq's hand. It was another piece of paper. "If he comes back, give him this," the man said, "and say nothing to anyone else." Rafiq barely had time to respond before the stranger turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows just as the car's doors opened. Two men stepped out, their movements sharp, deliberate. They were dressed in dark clothes, their faces blank, unreadable. They scanned the street, their eyes settling on Rafiq. For a moment, no one moved. The air between them was thick, heavy with something unspoken. Then, one of the men stepped forward. "You saw him, didn't you?" Rafiq's hands clenched around the paper. His mind screamed at him to lie, to say he didn't know what they were talking about. But something in their eyes told him it wouldn't matter what he said. They already knew. Still, he forced himself to shake his head. "I don't know who you mean." The man studied him, his gaze piercing. A tense silence stretched between them. Then, without another word, the man turned and signaled to his companion. They both walked back to the car, got in, and drove away. Rafiq stood frozen, his pulse hammering in his ears. It was over. At least for now. His eyes dropped to the folded paper in his hand. With shaky fingers, he opened it. It wasn't a message. It was an address. For a long time, he just stared at it. He had a choice now, to forget this night, to return to his normal life and pretend none of this had ever happened, or to go. Rafiq closed his eyes and exhaled. He had only given a hungry man food. That was all. But somehow, that simple act had led him here, to a moment that felt bigger than himself. After a few minutes, he pocketed the note, packed up his cart, and walked away. The city carried on around him, unaware of the small but significant choice he had just made. Somewhere in the distance, beyond the streetlights and the noise, an answer waited, and Rafiq knew he wasn't ready to walk away just yet.